Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. And it's time to see what's making the headlines with the columnist for the Eye, Ian Dunt, and the broadcaster and former government minister, Anna Soubry. They'll be with us now until just before midnight. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Welcome to you both. Now, let's see what is on the front of some of those pages. The Guardian leads with concerns that a pact over nuclear submarines between the UK, the US and Australia could inflame tensions with China. The Times reports on Theresa May's question to the Prime Minister, asking whether the new alliance could drag the UK into a war with China over Taiwan. The Mail leads on news that travel testing rules are going to be eased for people who are fully vaccinated. According to The Telegraph, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has urged decisive action against climate protesters who have twice blocked the M25 this week. The Financial Times understands that Chancellor Rishi Sunak will use his budget speech next month to announce a series of measures designed to curb government borrowing. And the Metro hears from the sports presenter Gavin Ramjohn, who expresses his disgust that tweets sent to him containing anti-Asian racial slurs were deemed not to have violated Twitter's policies on hate speech. Well, as I said, we are joined tonight by Ian Dunt and Anna Soubry. Welcome to you both. Lots of interesting front pages to look at this evening. And you've chosen to kick off. Ian, we'll start with you with The Guardian, page 1. And this is about this trade deal, AUKUS, and the fact that possibly it could provoke China, according to The Guardian.
Well, I think the Chinese are, able to read between the lines. You didn't have to be sort of an investigative journalist to try and work out where it was the US and Britain and Australia were coming from. This is clearly a policy that's intended to control any kind of expansion from China and trying to put them slightly more in their place. We've had a long period of essentially trying to be friends with the Chinese, of essentially allowing the Chinese to continue as they were. Now, I think probably partly as a sort of overreaction to some of the humiliation that we saw of the West over Afghanistan. We've seen the US, the UK and Australia line up very strongly indeed. And it's provoked exactly the kind of reaction you would expect from China, the kind of reaction you would expect from France on the basis of, France lost out on some submarine contracts that it had already sort of deposited a lot of money in. But nevertheless, I can't imagine that anyone was surprised by the sort of response we see from China or why anyone would be particularly put off by it.
Anna, do you think this is a good deal for the UK?
Well, we've got to see, haven't we? I think one of the things I find peculiar is there's no mention in any of this about the impact on NATO. It seems that sort of NATO is increasingly being sidelined and everything. And as I agree absolutely with what Ian says in his analysis, and understandably the French are cheesed off. I think the thing that really struck me, though, was that Theresa May increasingly is playing the role of the leader of the unofficial opposition, if not the actual opposition. And because it was her question that, and it was a good question from her, where she specifically asked about Taiwan. And she says, and it's reported in both The Guardian and in The Times, that she asks the question to Johnson in the House of Commons today. She said, what happens if China goes and basically invades Taiwan? What is the implications of that? Will we get dragged into some war between America and China? And of course, Boris Johnson sort of bumbled his way through it all by not ruling out anything or ruling anything in. But these are interesting times, very interesting times, because we are having to recraft a lot of our foreign policy, of course, now that we've left the European Union.
And Ian, as Anna says there, Theresa May, her question on the front of The Times, tell us if the deal will drag Britain to war. The message from the UK to China has been that there's no cause for concern, you don't need to be worried, but should actually it be, as Anna says, that we actually should be more concerned about whether we will become dragged into a relationship with China that we possibly don't necessarily want to have on the world stage?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the downsides is that we have a prime minister who doesn't seem to be capable of strategic thought. So most of the decisions that he takes are very, very deeply self-interested. They're usually very short-termist. They're a reaction to events as they're taking place. You saw that, with the reshuffle. You're seeing it again in this case. Many other prime ministers might have come to the same conclusion, especially faced with his backbenchers and desperately trying to find something that they can cooperate with the American president on, given Joe Biden's sort of outrage over the manner in which the Irish issue and the peace process has been treated by Boris Johnson. So on that basis, they're making judgments. And I think when Theresa May asks those questions, what she's really doing, she's one of those figures that, has become much more impressive out of Downing Street than she ever was in it. You do have to wonder occasionally why some people can't try to live up to the full ability when they're actually in that building and have to wait until they're back on the back benches. But there we are. I think what she was sort of getting at with Boris Johnson was, have you thought through the potential outcomes from the current course of action that you're taking? As it happens, the course of action he's taking right now seems very sensible. But when you've got a figure like him, you are going to have that concern. And I suspect that that's exactly the concern that Theresa May has.
Mm. Anna, do you think that we may regret this deal, or do you think that this is part of the new post-Brexit world, that Britain has to forge these kind of deals to set itself apart from other countries and other organisations?
Well, I think it's a very big mistake if we think that we are no longer going to have an ally in the European Union, or rather the countries within the European Union, and that somehow we have to cast them adrift because we're going to have forging new relations, whether it's in trade or defence, with other countries. And of course, as a member of the European Union, we sat so beautifully between what was meant to be that special relationship with the United States, our membership of the European Union. And so we were often seen as an arbitrator, if you like, between the States and between the European Union. And that was to our terrific advantage. And it gave us a grown-up voice on the international stage, which I think has pretty much disappeared. And a lot of this deal, Johnson will love it because it makes him feel important. And no doubt part of his so-called global Britain.
But Ian, I suppose the point is, how important is the UK to this deal? It's being played across the rest of the world. It took the front of the New York Times as an American-Australia deal, and that Britain is very much a bit partner in it.
Yeah, I mean, lots of the assistance is going to Australia, and obviously geographically, that's what makes it very pertinent. I mean, so the real question we end up asking is just how important is Britain to America? And if you want an answer to that, you only have to go through the news headlines that we've been seeing, 3 weeks ago, a month ago when it comes to Afghanistan. I mean, there was no notion that, Britain was a partner to America. America could barely be bothered to tell us what it was doing when it was leading Afghanistan. This was not Trump. This is not an outright nationalist president. This is Joe Biden, someone who said he wanted to repair, America's international standing. And it wasn't just Britain, by the way, it was the whole of Europe. What happens in Afghanistan washes up on Europe's shores in insecurity and refugee flows. Biden barely bothered to even talk to anyone in Europe about it. And that made Britain look, humiliated in a way that was simply objectively accurate to our position. If you're going to base the entirety of your foreign policy on working with America, you better recognize the fact that you're going to be a junior partner in a way that we were not when we, for instance, cooperate with France, the other great military power in Europe. You could see that lack of capacity there. None of that would have changed here. The only, both Australia and Britain are add-ons to this scenario, and Australia, for geopolitical reasons, obviously has a more dominant role.
Anna, it has taken the headlines off the political reshuffle, though. And while we've got you on, what are your thoughts about the movements, the deck chairs that have been moved around the deck over the last 24, 48 hours?
Well, that's a very good way to describe it, because a lot of this is just moving people around. I mean, obviously a few people were sacked, and most of them should have, to the two, that Williamson and Jenrick should have gone at least a year ago.
Not Dominic Raab?
Raab should have had the decency to resign, shouldn't have needed to be sacked. I mean, he was on holiday, this huge failure in foreign policy, and the man was on holiday and refused to come back and got a holiday pass from Boris Johnson. If he'd got any decency at all, he would have resigned. So he's had to be booted out. But of course, he's been, he's not good enough to be Foreign Secretary, but he is good enough apparently to be the Deputy Prime Minister in the event that the Prime Minister is in some way incapacitated. He can be our Prime Minister. I mean, it's outrageous. And as you know, I know it's been reported in other places, my views about the appointment of people like Nadine Dorries, which just sums up how useless Boris Johnson is. And you do actually have now a cabinet, I think, of sycophants and mates. I mean, there are some good people in that cabinet, don't get me wrong. But unfortunately, they're all mates of Johnson's. And so nobody is going to stand up to it. And you won't have the good debate that you need in a cabinet. You're not going to have any form of debate and discussion. And there are no big beasts and there are no big people with big ideas. And then as our Foreign Secretary, we have Liz Truss, who, remember, had to be removed when she was Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice because she was rubbish in that job.
Ian, do you think that we're seeing? Ian, do you think that some people are wondering that a lot of people who've got these roles must know where all the bodies are buried?
Yeah, I mean, there was a bit of that. I mean, you always had Gavin Williamson trying to not so subtly suggest that he knew where the bodies were buried from when he was aware. It hasn't worked out for him very well. He's now sat on the backbenches. I mean, most of the time, you saw people just trying to spare their blushes, really. But you look at how Boris Johnson spared the blushes of Dominic Raab. I mean, he gave him basically Britain's criminal justice system, as a consolation prize. Now, that's been in a state for 10 years now. Prisons dilapidated, prisoners being traumatized, sky-high levels of suicide, self-harm, violent assault, traumatizing prisoners rather than rehabilitating them. A probation service that was, privatized, split apart into various sections, then deprivatized, put back together. All of this just under this Tory, administration. Courts, hundreds of courts in England and Wales closed down. Whole swathes of the law where you don't have access to any kind of legal aid. Just a complete sort of implosion of our capacity to deliver justice in this country. And why does that happen? Why? Because we've had 8 justice secretaries over 10 years. That's how much we care about the position. And how did most of them get it? The same way that Rob gets it now. Because you just you treat it like a waste paper basket to dump someone in when they failed somewhere else so you can spare their blushes. I mean, that really, you look at that and just think, if this is the way to run a country, it's no wonder that we've ended up in such a terrible mess.
You mentioned Dominic Raab being on holiday, Anna, and the possible ditching of the PCR tests for travellers is on the front of the Telegraph. They do cost a lot, don't they? Do you think this is going to be welcomed? Do you think it's a good idea to ditch them, though?
Hugely. Absolutely. I mean, I've just come back from 10 days in Portugal. So I have experienced these tests and I've paid the money. I have to say, not reported in any of the papers, to my knowledge, that the people who live in the European Union actually have that vaccine passport, and they just have to show that. And there are a few countries where you do have to take tests when you arrive in those countries. But for us as Brits, of course, have one of the highest infection rates in the world. It is extremely ironic that when we come back from countries which have lower rates than us, somehow we have to take tests. But it does need a huge reform. If you've been double jabbed and you can prove that you've got that double vaccination, I don't see why. You certainly don't understand why you have to take a PCR test.
It also
and these
feels
are very expensive. I've calculated about £150. The flights, by the way, were about 60 quid.
Yeah.
So I mean, the whole thing is.
We had a similar.
And we need to get our airlines up, and and we need to get our tourist industry regenerated. And this is one of the ways to do it.
We had a similar experience as a family, and I sort of felt that the PCR tests, when you come back to the UK, that you have to do, and you send them off, they were all negative. But you sort of think, well, who's monitoring that? If they weren't, would we have been?
Nobody.
Would we have been contacted? It just seemed like a slightly pointless exercise, I have to say.
Yeah, I agree with you. But anyway, hopefully common sense is now going to break out.
Ian, the front of the Times also focusing on holidays, holiday hotspots off COVID red list in time for the half-term break. So as well as the regulations changing, we might see this traffic light system changing. Is this a good idea, or are we going to see a huge spike in COVID numbers if everybody piles onto planes and goes off to try and get a bit of winter sun in October?
Well, let's be clear that we're going to see a spike in, I mean, you never know absolutely, and we thought that in the summer and it didn't transpire. But it would be very surprising if we don't see a rise in COVID cases over this period, regardless of what's going on with travel, because it's going to get colder, people are going to be inside more. We know that in those kind of situations, at a pub where people are drinking, when they're talking loudly, these are the kind of places you get infections. What we're hoping, and what seems to be the case, if you, for instance, look at the Public Health England report that very recently came out on waning immunity, on how unlikely it is that people with vaccines end up being hospitalised or at the worst dying, that we won't see quite so high a death rate. I mean, when we started implementing the system for travel, we had much more severe restraints domestically. Now, I think that they opened up travel too quickly. They certainly opened up domestically too quickly and far too extensively. But given that we have done that, it seems like a bit of a misnomer, the severity of the international travel system. And to be honest, if you can find someone who really understands the traffic, I mean, the traffic lights were hard enough to understand before they added that sort of, what was France in, a sort of yellow plus category. So by the time that it moved on to, it wasn't even a traffic light anymore. It was essentially a mathematical equation. You thought,
it was a Bleacher beacon.
It was what?
A Bleacher beacon. It was a flashing amber.
Yeah, that's quite right. Yeah. So, I mean, by this point, you just think, well, OK, clear the whole thing out, which seems to be the way that they're going.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Ian Dunt and Anna Soubry. And the front of the Telegraph is your choice for this section. And Ian, this is about Priti Patel telling the police to get tough on climate protesters after it emerged that there's footage which the Telegraph has seen, which shows the police escorting some of these protesters onto the motorway because they made apparently a dynamic risk assessment.
Yeah, Anna and I were worried before we did this that we were going to agree on too many things. So I suspect this is going to be an area in which we disagree. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before. We saw it actually, do you remember when they toppled the statue in Bristol and people asked why didn't the police intervene then? The thing is, the police on the scene have to make an assessment as to risks. I mean, you've got a bunch of people who are trying to get onto a motorway. There is a very obvious potential for risk. It isn't really to celebrate what the protesters are doing. I get very irritated with this kind of environmental protest. And I think if you're committed to doing something about climate change, pretty much the worst PR you can do is this attempt to just sort of almost aggressively, get in the way of people's lives and just stop them from being able to do really quite elementary things. But that risk assessment we leave up to the police for a reason, which is that they are there to protect lives, to facilitate protests, but to protect lives, and they have to do it on the scene. Okay. Instead, what we've got now from Priti Patel is this very aggressive attempt to sort of, say the police are, sort of the suggestion is that they're woke and that they're helping the protesters too much. There's someone in that copy quoted as saying we need to treat them like Islamic terrorists, and you just think that does an injustice to protesters and to the person speaking.
Sorry, we're running out of time, so I just quickly want to get Anna's thoughts on this. We've only got 30 seconds, Anna. Are you with Priti Patel on this?
Between us. But I am very much of the view that the police should actually, that their role is to protect citizens and to maintain law and order. People have a right to peaceful protest, but also they have a right to go about their business. And you have to get the balance right. And I think that the Met Police in particular, and this is my own experience from demonstrations outside Parliament when I was a member of Parliament, I think they've got it wrong. I think they've gone from one extreme, when you might remember there was a man who died when they were kettling people, which was absolutely the wrong way to police protests, now to the situation where pretty much any protester can do anything and everybody else is just tough. And on that, I think that I don't care what the issue is, by the way, I don't discriminate on it. The police should police it properly, just like they would anything else. Okay. They've gone too far the other way.
We're out of time for this hour, but Anna and Ian, thank you both very much. You're going to stay with us and give us your thoughts as we go through the rest of the day's news after the break.